What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue and I hope you're all doing well today. In this video, we'll be going over our deep dive discussion on the Subtlety Rogue talent tree coming in Dragonflight. Keep in mind, this is a very preliminary look at some very big changes to how we're going to go about choosing our abilities and utility, so things are always subject to tuning and change. The main goal of this video is to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the current iteration of the Subtlety spec talent tree, as well as to showcase some of the potentially strong effects or good synergies we may be able to take advantage of. If you want to look into the main rogue class tree, I did a discussion video on that recently, which I'll leave a link to in the top right corner of the screen now. As a side note, since it's a new project I'm working on, I've finally set up my Twitch channel and will likely be streaming a couple of times a week with more rogue stuff for when I'm in between editing videos, so feel free to stop in sometime and say hi. As with all talent trees coming in Dragonflight, there are talent point thresholds that must be reached before you can progress further into your tree. These thresholds are at 8 and 20 points respectively, and we will earn a total of 30 points by the time we reach level 70 as we alternate points between our spec tree and our class tree. We're going to go over some numbers because numbers are just so exciting and interesting. There are a total of 44 different talents on the Subtlety tree, and if you include talents with multiple talent point investment opportunities, there are a total of 50 point allocations, meaning we can fill up exactly 60% of total available point slots. Numerous of these points are for mobility and defensive gains, though a vast majority revolve around ways to pump up our damage and flush out our DPS rotation. Interestingly enough, of the 44 unique talent options, only 7 of them are new, a term which I use loosely since technically 2 of them are from Battle for Azeroth's Azerite armor system, though slightly reworked. Still, even counting the BFA re-added effects, this is a mere 16% of total options being new choices, whereas Outlaw sits around 29% of their tree being new or returning from other expansion effects, and Assassination comes in right behind with 26%. This can be seen as both a good and a bad thing, as having many familiar abilities means that your playstyle and choices are likelier easier to understand and work with, whereas adding a bunch of new effects can sometimes result in a spec feeling completely different than it did in prior expansions because of how many rotational nuances and tuning passes will need to be done to understand things fully. One thing to note is that Dragonflight's version of Subtlety is leaning more into the shadow damage side of the specialization, which offers the benefits of more of your damage bypassing armor. Of the new effects being added to Subtlety, we have Veil Touched, which gives your abilities a 10% boost to magic damage. This should then apply to any school of magic, such as Arcane from the Echoing Reprimand talent on the main rogue tree, or Poisons, which normally deal nature damage, and all of our shadow bonuses that we'll be discussing in this video, with the new Dark Brew passive being one of them. This converts our poison damage from nature into shadow, and it buffs our poison's damage by 30% as well. We also have a big gain to our backstab damage with the new Lingering Shadow effect. This is a 2-point talent further down the tree, and whenever Shadow Dance expires, your backstabs will either deal 50 or 100% more damage as Shadow, and this loses efficacy by 2% of its damage every second. This sounds like a very big quality of life gain for Subtlety's damage output, as it's often considered a wet noodle outside of its Shadow Dance windows, so by increasing backstab damage by 100% when you're out of Shadow Dance, and it being Shadow means it's increased even further thanks to that new Veil Touched passive and the returning Deeper's Dagger effect from Shadowlands, which buffs shadow damage by 15% for 8 seconds after using Eviscerate or Black Powder. Not to mention the Shadow Blade's cooldown, giving all combo point generators an additional 30% shadow damage while it's active too. We also see the return of Replicating Shadow, a Battle for Azeroth Azerite armor effect, though in an improved form. Your ruptures will deal an additional 30% damage, what a surprise, as Shadow, and it will also apply to a second target within 8 yards. This talent should give Subtlety a slight gain in its 2-target cleave, something that Subtlety has been sorely needing for quite a while. How much it'll actually help in damage output I can't say, but really in 2-target situations all you'd be doing is applying Rupture anyhow, so this also ends up being a nice quality of life improvement and allows you to just stay on the primary target more easily. I'm not quite sure how this will work in multi-target situations though, as it'll depend if it's a debuff that's smart enough to know if the target already has the Rupture on it, or if it's just gonna always pick the next closest target, kinda like how Serrated Bone Spikes currently works in Shadowlands with the Death Spike effect. Another returning Azerite armor trait, Inevitability, allows your backstabs and shadow strikes to increase the duration of your current symbols of death by half a second each. This is actually a nerfed version of that armor trait from BFA, since it previously also included a damage boost to backstab and shadow strike, as well as that increased buff duration when you hit with those. I remember this being a pretty decent Azerite armor power, at least to have one of. However, being as far down the tree as it is, it might not be worth the investment. This is something I feel that the theory crafters over at Ravenholt will figure out, and once we get a better idea of our damage profile and if this extra Symbols of Death duration actually adds anything to our throughput, or if it's just wasted. Without a Trace is another new effect for Subtlety, which merely gives you an extra charge of Vanish. Now, in regards to your damage dealing rotation, this is probably a very minimal gain at best. Although the Invigorating Shadow Dust legendary has made it onto the Subtlety tree, which reduces all cooldowns by up to 20 seconds when you use Vanish, Subtlety doesn't exactly have a way to get Vanish off cooldown, unlike Outlaw Rogue's Restless Blade's passive cooldown reduction effect. I could probably see this being very handy in PvP though, as there's also a trait that I'll be talking about later that gives you an Absorb Shield whenever you cast Vanish. For one of our capstones on our tree, we have a new effect called Shadow Mist. Whenever you enter Stealth, use Vanish, or Shadow Dance, you'll expel some gas, a Shadow Mist, yeah, definitely that. When you walk into said poop gas, you'll then reset the cooldown of Shadow Step and supercharge one of your combo points, and when you spend exactly that many combo points on a damaging finisher, it'll function as if you'd use 7. So basically it's the combo point effect from Echoing Reprimand, and it's been added into numerous abilities, which means we'll be able to play the Echoing Reprimand minigame even if we don't take Echoing Reprimand from the main rogue tree. Yay! Now this is kind of weird in that it refreshes a charge of Shadow Step. Not that I don't appreciate having movement abilities being used practically whenever I want to, but between its short cooldown and the fact we can talent into 2 charges of Shadow Step, this definitely seems more like a PvP quality of life thing. Again, not a big issue, and it's totally cool, and it's a small quality of life gain even in PvE or raid content, as well as offering some extra damage and cooldown reduction on those shadow dances if you're talented into Deepening Shadows, which you should be. Shadow Mist should also allow for more finishers to be used, since you won't have to build up to full combo points quite as often, and I'm sure at least one of our GCDs in Shadow Dance will likely be used for one of these supercharged combo points. There's also the possibility that we can pop Vanish during our Shadow Dance and get another charged combo point. It doesn't really say you can't have more than one, so if it works like Echoing Reprimand, we'd actually might be able to have multiple of these in a single Shadow Dance, which is kinda handy. The last new feature for Subtlety is a party and raid effect known as Shrouded in Darkness. While Shroud of Concealment is active, all party and raid members will gain a 60% movement speed increase if they're within the radius of Shroud. Shroud has a 30-yard radius around the casting rogue, and if you have Shadow Dance active, this can in fact be used in combat and will last for the duration of your dance, which will be 9 seconds in Dragonflight. Now this is extremely niche, but it does give Subtlety a wide radius Stampeding Roar type effect, albeit on a much longer cooldown, and at the expense of one of your Shadow Dance charges, which is most likely going to be a DPS loss at any time that you would use this in a raid fight. In Mythic Plus, this could be very handy depending on the dungeon design, since most people are used to mounting up and shrouding, but if there are dungeons where you can't mount up or places that you want to skip that you can't mount, then this could make some pretty large bypasses of trash possible with this new movement speed. I don't feel this is quite on the same level of usefulness as the new Atrophic Poison for Assassination or Restless Crew for Outlaw though. Shroud is a 6-minute cooldown, meaning at best if your raid needs this movement effect multiple times, you might be able to use it 2 times depending on the fight, and that's if the times that you're using it even require extra movement capability. I'd like to see maybe a small AoE damage reduction to anyone in the Shroud effect, like 10, maybe 15% added to it, because as a raid-wide damage reduction effect, this could be substantially more useful than just movement speed on its own. Also, for those who noticed, there is a charge of Deeper Stratagem on the Subtlety spec tree, as well as on the main clash tree. For PvPers out there, we kinda joked that there might be 8-second kidney shots in Dragonflight, but it's looking like that's not gonna be the case. I'm not sure if they're gonna change Deeper Stratagem to just be damaging moves that get that extra effect, but I have a pretty good guess that they're not gonna let people have 8-second kidney shots, so 7 combo points of Deeper Stratagem probably isn't gonna be that useful, and also it isn't getting that 5% damage boost that Deeper Stratagem currently gives on top of the combo point usage, unfortunately. As I mentioned in my Outlaw video, a lot of Shadowlands conduits have been used to flesh out these talent trees, and Subtlety is no exception. Perforated Veins, Stiletto Staccato, Planned Execution, and Deeper Daggers have all made returning appearances from Shadowlands into Dragonflight, as well as a few Finesse and Endurance conduits too. Quick Decisions is an early choice in Subtlety's second row, giving that extra Shadow Step range and reduced cooldown of 20% in both regards, and Cloaked in Shadows is back to annoy PvPers. This new version only applies when you vanish though, giving a 30% absorb shield for 6 seconds when you do. A potent rework comes with the Fade to Nothing talent though. This gives a 20% movement speed buff for 8 seconds when you gain the effects of Stealth, Vanish, or Shadow Dance, which is basically how it is acted in Shadowlands. However, a flat 10% damage reduction has also been added to it, giving Subtlety a noteworthy edge in survivability. Ha, edge like a knife. Okay, yeah, fine, it wasn't that funny, I know, whatever. Now, jokes aside, there are a number of qualms I have with the current layout of Subtlety's talent tree, some of which are potentially in the midst of tweaks here and there already. There are some talent choices that are frankly pretty poorly placed. For instance, you can pick up Stiletto Staccato, that conduit that buffs your Shadow Techniques proc so that way it affects Shadow Blades, without actually picking up Shadow Techniques. This is clearly just a minor oversight that requires some repositioning, but an amusing one nonetheless. There's also the somewhat strict pathing for what types of builds you want to make. For instance, basically everything AoE related on Subtlety Tree is on the right hand side, such as your improved Shuriken Storm, Black Powder, Shuriken Tornado, Shuriken Storm itself, Secret Technique, and the Night Terror's Shuriken Tornado slow effect. Unfortunately, this comes at a cost because a lot of these multi-target moves are also very good in single target, such as the Deeper Daggers talent effect, the shadow damage bonus applying to finishing moves like Eviscerate and Black Powder, the new Dark Brew effect, and even the Replicating Shadows bonus damage to Rupture that I mentioned earlier. This means that while we can potentially reach 2 capstones, there are a lot of nodes on both sides and in the middle that make it very unlikely that you'll end up taking more than one, if any. Subtlety has kept a lot of passive effects from Shadowlands and its spec-specific effects, which ends up feeling a bit less exciting than having a bunch of new random powers or things from the past returning that you haven't probably already been using for the last 2 years. As a side note, for those who noticed Flagellation is on the Subtlety tree but is all the way down on the bottom right in the AoE side of things, it's sounding potentially like the version that we're going to actually get to use is going to give a mastery buff instead of haste, which would make it more appropriate as an AoE talent effect since mastery increases value with more targets, since we can spam Shuriken Storms and roll them into Black Powders or Eviscerates to still provide that funnel niche utility that we've had going around in Shadowlands. It also sounds like there are some potential movements of abilities going on to adjust the progression of talents and choices as you level. You'll also likely notice that no rogue tree has any choice nodes, which are those spots that hold 2 options to choose from in the same location. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind this was, and it doesn't really terribly bother me, but I figured it was just something interesting to point out, because it seems like this is the only class and spec trees that don't have any choice nodes. Also, it sounds like Shiv is going to be returning to the class-wide tree, as currently at this stage of alpha, Assassination is unfortunately the only spec that would have access to it, which would cut out Subtlety's ability to remove enrage effects, as well as applying empowered versions of crippling and numbing poisons on targets. Lastly, and this isn't really a huge gripe, but more than a concern, I worry Subtlety's getting a lot less cool and new interactions compared to both Assassination and Outlaw. Again, this isn't necessarily a negative point against the spec. One of the big things I just look forward to with new expansions is all new things that we're able to use or do. On the other hand, if you're already a big fan of the current iteration of Subtlety, then you'll slip right back into your comfort zone with Dragonflight. Personally, I'm hoping to see some additional branches or shifting of talents around to spice up our options and to give a little bit more choice, and maybe give something back like, I don't know, Death from Above or Shadow Reflection for a cooldown. Both of which I think would be very interesting options that fit Subtlety's niche and class fantasy and playstyle and all that. Honestly, just getting rid of Secret Technique and replacing it with Shadow Reflection would be pretty huge in my book, since Secret Technique has just never felt like a very compelling option to me. Anyways folks, I hope this deep dive into the Subtlety talent tree was interesting to you. I plan on doing build videos in the future, as well as talking about more stuff like this on Twitch in between publishing more videos for the other specs and whatever other cool stuff we learn about in Dragonflight. If you did enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or maybe following my new Twitch channel, which I'm trying to get up and running. As always, my appreciation and gratitude to all of my viewers and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.